The needle slipped through her trembling fingers for the third time that morning, and Dorothy Whitmore wanted to scream at the unfairness of it all. But instead she bit her lip and retrieved the cursed thing from where it had fallen into the dust beside her boots. The year was 1876, and Hot Springs, South Dakota, had proven itself to be exactly as unwelcoming as she had feared when the stagecoach had deposited her here 2 months ago with nothing but a battered trunk and her late aunt's sewing machine. The women at the church social had made their opinions abundantly clear yesterday afternoon, when Widow Henderson held up the shirt Dorothy had labored over for 3 entire evenings, turning it this way, and that so everyone could see the crooked seams wandering across the fabric like drunken snakes. "She cannot sew a straight stitch to save her life," Mrs. Patterson had announced with the kind of triumphant disgust usually reserved for discovering a rat in the flour barrel. "Look at this mess. Who on earth would wear such a thing?" Dorothy had fled before the tears could start, and now she sat in the small room she rented above the general store, wondering how she was supposed to survive in this harsh Dakota territory, when she could not even master the one skill every woman was supposed to possess naturally. Her mother had despaired of her clumsy fingers back in Philadelphia, and her aunt had tried to teach her properly before the consumption took her last year. But something in Dorothy's hands simply refused to cooperate with her intentions. She could read Latin and calculate figures faster than most accountants, but ask her to sew a hem, and the result looked like a child had attacked the fabric with a rusty fork. The problem was that sewing was how she had planned to earn her living out here. The advertisement she had answered promised steady work for a seamstress in a growing frontier town. But whoever had placed that notice had clearly assumed that anyone calling themselves a seamstress could actually sew. Dorothy had perhaps stretched the truth in her response letter, desperation making her bold in ways her naturally honest nature would never have allowed under different circumstances. Now, she was trapped in Hot Springs with $17 to her name and winter coming on fast. The peaks of the Black Hills loomed to the northwest, already dusted with snow in late September, and she had heard the locals talking about how brutal the cold could get once November arrived. She needed work. She needed money. She needed a miracle. The sound of heavy boots on the stairs outside her door made her look up from the mangled shirt in her lap. Those were not the quick, light steps of Mrs. Chen, who owned the store below, but something slower and heavier, like a bear had learned to walk upright and was coming to collect the rent. Dorothy stuffed the evidence of her incompetence under a pillow and smoothed her dark hair back from her face, trying to look like a respectable woman who had not been on the verge of tears moments ago. The knock that followed shook her door in its frame. "Miss Whitmore, Mrs. Chen said you do sewing work." The voice was deep as a canyon and rough as tree bark, and when Dorothy opened the door she had to tilt her head back to see the face that went with it. The man standing in her narrow hallway was the largest human being she had ever encountered, well over 6 feet of solid muscle wrapped in buckskin and worn wool. His hair was dark brown and hung past his shoulders, tied back with a leather cord, and his beard was trimmed close enough to show the strong line of his jaw. His eyes were an unexpected warm brown, like honey held up to lamplight, and they regarded her with a mixture of hope and awkwardness that seemed entirely at odds with his intimidating size. "I am she," Dorothy said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "How may I help you, Mr. Asher Larson?" he said, and pulled off his hat with hands that looked capable of crushing stone. "I am sorry to bother you, miss, but I have a problem. I have been up in the mountains for near 3 months running my trap lines, and I came back to find that pack rats got into my cabin and made a mess of most of my clothes. Mrs. Chen said you might be able to make me some new shirts and maybe patch my winter coat before the snow sets in proper. Dorothy's heart sank even as her desperate mind screamed at her to say yes, to take his money, to worry about the actual sewing later. But she had been raised to be honest even when honesty hurt, and this man with his kind eyes and obvious need did not deserve to be cheated. Mr. Larson, I appreciate you thinking of me, but I must confess that I am not the seamstress you are looking for. My work is substandard. The stitching is not straight and the seams are not reliable. You would be better served going to Mrs. Patterson or one of the other ladies in town. Something shifted in Asher Larson's expression, a tightening around his eyes that might have been disappointment or might have been something else entirely. I already tried Mrs. Patterson, he said quietly. She said she was too busy with important work to waste time on a mountain man's rags. Mrs. Henderson said much the same, though she used more words to say it. You are the fourth person I have asked, Miss Whitmore, and the only one who has been honest with me instead of just slamming the door in my face. The admission made Dorothy's chest ache with sympathetic anger. She had only been in Hot Springs for 2 months, but that had been long enough to understand the social hierarchies at play. The proper town ladies looked down on the mountain men who came in from the high country to trade their furs and buy supplies, treating them like dangerous animals barely fit for civilization. Never mind that these men's knowledge and skill kept them alive in conditions that would kill a city dweller in a matter of days. Never mind that their trade in furs and their work as guides brought money into the local economy. They were uncouth and uncivilized and therefore beneath notice unless they had coin to spend. Come in, Dorothy said, making a decision that was probably foolish but felt right in her bones. Let me see what you need, and I will tell you truthfully what I can attempt. Asher Larson was too large for her small room, his presence seeming to fill every corner as he stepped inside and carefully closed the door behind him, leaving it open a crack for propriety's sake. He pulled a bundle from under his arm and unwrapped it to reveal several shirts in various states of destruction. The pack rats had indeed done their worst, leaving holes and tears that would need more than simple patching. I mostly need work shirts, he explained, his big hands surprisingly gentle as he spread the damaged garments out on her small table. Sturdy cloth that can stand up to rough use, nothing fancy, and my winter coat has a tear in the shoulder seam that needs fixing before the cold comes on hard. Dorothy examined the damage and felt her inadequacy settle over her shoulders like a lead blanket. This was not decorative sewing or fine detail work where crooked stitches would merely be unsightly. This was practical work that needed to hold up against hard use in brutal conditions. If her seams failed, this man could freeze. Mr. Larson, I am being serious when I say my work is not good. The stitches wander. The seams are crooked. I cannot guarantee that what I make will hold. Can you guarantee that you will do your honest best? He asked, and his warm brown eyes met hers with an intensity that made her breath catch slightly. Yes, she said without hesitation. I promise I will do my absolute best. Then that is good enough for me, Asher said simply. I will pay you fair wages. $3 for each shirt and $2 for fixing the coat. Does that sound reasonable? It was more than reasonable. It was generous to the point of charity, and Dorothy's pride bristled even as her desperate finances screamed at her to accept. That is too much, Mr. Larson. I cannot accept such payment for work that may not hold. You can and you will, he said with a firmness that suggested he was accustomed to making decisions and sticking to them. If a seam fails, I will take responsibility for accepting the risk. You are being honest with me about your skill level, which is more than anyone else in this town has done, and honesty is worth paying for. Dorothy felt something warm unfurl in her chest, something that had been closed and cold since the church social humiliation. "I need to take your measurements," she said, pleased that her voice emerged steady. "And I will need to buy cloth from Mrs. Chen downstairs, which will take some of the payment." "Buy good sturdy fabric," Asher told her, pulling out a leather wallet that looked hand-stitched. "I will give you money up front for materials. And Miss Whitmore, thank you. You do not know what it means to have someone just treat me like a regular person needing regular help." He counted out bills onto her table, and Dorothy found herself staring at more money than she had seen since arriving in Hot Springs. This would buy fabric and thread and leave enough to pay her rent through November. It was a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman, and the fact that it came from this gentle-voiced mountain man with his damaged clothes and kind eyes made something shift in her understanding of the world. "I will need you to stand still while I measure," she said, picking up her tape measure with hands that only trembled slightly. "This may take a few minutes." Asher Larson stood as patient as a horse being shod while Dorothy worked her way around his massive frame, calling out numbers that she scratched down on a piece of paper. His shoulders were impossibly broad, his chest deep with muscle earned from hard physical labor, his arms thick enough that she could barely reach her measuring tape around them. He smelled like pine smoke and leather and something wild that made her think of the forested mountains she had glimpsed from the stage coach window. "You are not from here originally," he said while she measured his chest, the words rumbling up from somewhere deep inside him. "Your accent is Eastern." "Philadelphia," Dorothy confirmed, trying to focus on the numbers and not on the fact that she was closer to this man than propriety would normally allow. "My aunt lived here and I came to stay with her, but she passed before I arrived. I have been trying to make a living since then with limited success." "I am sorry about your aunt," Asher said quietly. "That must have been hard, arriving to find her gone." "It was," Dorothy admitted, moving around to measure his back. "I sold almost everything I owned to buy the stagecoach ticket west. Going back is not an option even if I wanted to, which I do not. Philadelphia holds nothing for me anymore." "What brought you west in the first place?" he asked. "Besides your aunt, I mean." "Most women would have stayed in the city where things are comfortable and civilized." Dorothy paused in her measuring, considering how much truth to share with this stranger who had somehow made her small room feel safe instead of cramped. "I wanted something different," she said finally. "I wanted to see if I could be more than what Philadelphia said I should be. So far the experiment has not gone as planned, but I am not ready to admit defeat yet." "Good," Asher said with conviction. "The West has no time for people who give up easy. It is hard and it is mean sometimes, but it is honest about what it is. I prefer that to cities where everyone smiles while stabbing you in the back." Dorothy finished her measuring and stepped back, recording the last numbers on her paper. "You do not like cities much, I take it." "I grew up in one," Asher said, rolling his shoulders now that she had finished. "St. Louis. My father was a merchant, and he expected me to follow in his footsteps, working in a counting house and wearing proper suits and marrying a proper girl and living a proper boring life, until I died of propriety at age 40. I ran away when I was 17 and came west, and I have never regretted it for a single day." 17, Dorothy repeated, doing quick math. "How long ago was that?" 10 years, Asher said. "I am 27 now, and I have a cabin up in the Black Hills where I run trap lines in winter and guide hunting parties in summer. It is a good life. A hard life, but mine." Dorothy was 22 herself, and something about knowing that this man was only 5 years older than her made him seem less intimidating and more real. "It sounds lonely," she said before she could think better of it. Sometimes, Asher admitted with an honesty that surprised her. But I have friends among the other mountain men and the Dakota who live up in the high country, and I come down to town every few months for supplies and to remember why I prefer the mountains. He pulled his coat back on and settled his hat over his dark hair. When do you think you might have the shirts ready? 2 weeks, Dorothy hazarded, trying to calculate how long it would take her clumsy fingers to construct serviceable garments. Maybe 3 for everything including the coat repair. That works fine, Asher said. I will be in town through October at least, helping old Samuel Watson cut firewood for the winter. He is too stiff in his joints to do it himself anymore, and his daughter worries about him. He moved toward the door, then paused. Miss Whitmore, do not let those church ladies make you feel small. Some people only feel big when they are cutting others down. You just keep being honest and kind, and you will do just fine out here. Then he was gone, his heavy boots thumping down the stairs, and Dorothy was left standing in her small room with a pile of measurements and more money than she had seen in months, and a strange warm feeling in her chest that she did not quite know what to name. She went downstairs to Mrs. Chen's store and bought sturdy brown cotton duck fabric that would stand up to rough use, plus strong thread and spare needles, since she tended to break them with her determined but clumsy stitching. Mrs. Chen, a sharp-eyed woman from Canton who had come to South Dakota with her miner husband and stayed after he died in a cave-in, watched her with knowing eyes. You take work from Asher Larson, she said. It was not a question. He is good man, honest. Always pays full price, never argues, never treats me like stupid Chinese woman. You do good work for him. I will try, Dorothy promised, and meant it with every fiber of her being. That night she cut out her first shirt by lamplight, using one of the damaged ones as a rough pattern. Her cuts were not perfectly straight, but they were close enough, and she pinned the pieces together with meticulous care before attempting the first seam. The stitching that resulted was just as crooked as everything she had ever sewn, the line of thread meandering across the fabric like a creek wandering through a meadow, but it was tight and it was strong, and when she pulled on it experimentally, it held. That would have to be enough. She worked on Asher Larson's shirts every evening after helping Mrs. Chen in the store during the day, a job she had taken in exchange for a reduction in her rent. The work was not particularly skilled, mostly stocking shelves and helping customers, but it was honest, and Mrs. Chen was kind in her brusque way. Dorothy's fingers grew sore from pushing the needle through the heavy fabric, and she had to redo the collar on the second shirt 3 times before it sat right, but slowly the garments took shape. They were not beautiful. The seams wandered and the stitching was visible and uneven, and no one would ever mistake them for professional work. But they were sturdy and they were warm, and she had put her whole heart into making them as good as her limited skills would allow. Asher Larson came by the store on the 8th day, his face ruddy from outdoor work and wood chips clinging to his hair. "How is the sewing coming along?" he asked when Dorothy came to the counter. "It is coming," she said carefully. "Would you like to see the progress?" "I would," he said, and followed her upstairs, Mrs. Chen watching them go with an expression that suggested she saw far more than Dorothy would have liked. Dorothy spread the 2 completed shirts out on her table, steeling herself for criticism. "The seams are crooked," she said before he could speak. "I try to make them straight, but my hands do not cooperate with my intentions, but they are strong. I have tested every seam and they will hold." Asher picked up the first shirt and examined it carefully, turning it inside out to see the construction, pulling gently at the seams to test their strength. His face was unreadable, and Dorothy felt her heart sink with each passing second of silence. Then he pulled the shirt on over his own, shrugging it over his massive shoulders, and a smile spread across his bearded face like sunrise over the mountains. "It fits perfect," he said with obvious delight. "The arms are the right length, the shoulders do not pull, and there is room to move." "Miss Whitmore, this is the best-fitting shirt I have had in years." "But the seams," Dorothy started to say, and Asher waved a dismissive hand. "The seams are fine. They are just not fancy, which suits me perfectly since I am not a fancy man. This will keep me warm and it will last, which is all I need from a shirt. You are being far too hard on yourself." The relief that flooded through Dorothy was almost dizzying. "You are certain? You are not just being kind. I am being honest," Asher said firmly. "I do not have time for pretty lies, Miss Whitmore. If this shirt was poor work, I would tell you so we could fix it. But it is not poor work. It is exactly what I need." He ran his hands down the front of the garment, his expression turning thoughtful. "You know what I think? I think you have been trying to sew like those town ladies, all perfect and prissy when you should be sewing like yourself. Practical, strong, built to last rather than built to impress." Dorothy stared at him, something shifting in her understanding. She had spent her whole life trying to make her stitches look like her mother's, like her aunt's, like the pictures in ladies' magazines, and failing miserably at the attempt. But Asher was right. These shirts were not pretty, but they were functional. They would do the job they were meant to do. Maybe that was enough. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You do not know how much I needed to hear that." "Then I am glad I said it," Asher replied. He carefully took the shirt off and laid it back on the table. "I will let you finish the rest, but I wanted to check in. And I wanted to ask if you might join me for supper tomorrow evening at the hotel restaurant. Nothing fancy, just a meal and conversation with someone who does not look at me like I am going to scalp them and steal their chickens." Dorothy's heart did something complicated in her chest. This was not Philadelphia, where a man asking a woman to supper was a carefully choreographed social dance requiring chaperones and calling cards. This was the frontier, where normal rules bent under the weight of practical necessity. And she found that she wanted very much to have supper with Asher Larson, to hear more about his life in the mountains, to talk to someone who seemed to see her as a person rather than a failed seamstress. "I would like that," she said. "What time?" 6 o'clock, Asher suggested. "I will meet you in the hotel lobby." After he left, Dorothy stood in her small room and felt something like hope beginning to grow in her chest. She had 3 more shirts to make and a coat to repair, but for the first time since arriving in Hot Springs, she felt like maybe she could do this. Maybe she could build a life here. Maybe the crooked seams and wandering stitches that had seemed like fatal flaws were actually just part of who she was, and maybe that was acceptable after all. The next evening she wore her best dress, a deep blue calico that she had not ruined because she had bought it ready-made, and pinned her dark hair up in a style that was simple but neat. The hotel restaurant was the finest establishment in Hot Springs, which admittedly was not saying much, but the food was reported to be decent, and the proprietor kept the place clean. Asher was waiting in the lobby when she arrived, and he had clearly made an effort as well. His hair was freshly washed and hung loose around his shoulders, his beard was neatly trimmed, and he wore what was probably his best shirt, though it had clearly seen better days. He stood when he saw her, his warm brown eyes lighting up with an expression that made Dorothy's breath catch slightly. "Miss Whitmore," he said, offering his arm. "You look lovely." "Thank you," Dorothy replied, taking his arm and trying not to think about how solid the muscle was beneath her fingers. "You look quite presentable yourself, Mr. Larson." "Asher, please," he said as he led her into the dining room. "I am not much for formality." "Then you must call me Dorothy," she replied, and his smile suggested that he was pleased by this development. They settled at a table near the window, and Dorothy tried not to notice the stares from the other diners. She could practically feel Mrs. Patterson's disapproval from across the room, but she found that she did not particularly care. Let them stare. Let them gossip. She was having supper with a kind man who had treated her with more respect in 2 conversations than the church ladies had shown in 2 months. "Tell me about your mountains," Dorothy said after they had ordered. "What is it like up there?" Asher's expression softened in a way that made him look younger. "It is beautiful in a way that makes your chest ache," he said. "The peaks go up so high they scrape the sky, and the pine forests are so thick that barely any light reaches the ground. There are meadows full of wildflowers in summer, and creeks so clear you can count the pebbles on the bottom. In winter, everything goes quiet under the snow and you can hear your own heartbeat in the silence." "It sounds lonely," Dorothy said, echoing her earlier observation. "It is," Asher admitted, "but it is also peaceful. No one up there cares if you use the wrong fork, or wear the wrong clothes, or say the wrong thing. You just survive or you do not, and there is something freeing about that level of honesty." Their food arrived, and they ate while Asher told her stories about his life in the high country. He talked about tracking elk through the snow, about fishing in mountain lakes so cold they made your bones ache, about the time a black bear tried to break into his cabin, and he had to scare it off by banging pots together. He made her laugh with his descriptions of the other mountain men. Crusty old trappers with names like Three-Finger Jack and Stumpy Pete, who were harder than granite and twice as stubborn. In return, Dorothy told him about Philadelphia, about growing up in a house full of books where her father, the professor, had encouraged her education, but her mother had despaired of her ever becoming properly domestic. She told him about her aunt's letters that had painted the West as a place of opportunity and fresh starts, and about arriving in Hot Springs to find that frontier towns had their own rigid social structures that she fit into just as poorly as the city ones. "You fit in fine," Asher said with conviction. "You just fit in with the wrong crowd. The fancy church ladies are not the only people in Hot Springs, Dorothy. There are good folks here too, people who judge you on your character rather than your needlework. Like Mrs. Chen," Dorothy said, and Asher nodded. "Like Mrs. Chen, and like me, though I am only in town part of the year." He paused, his expression turning serious. "Can I ask you something personal?" "You may ask," Dorothy said carefully. "I reserve the right not to answer." "Fair enough." Asher turned his coffee cup in his big hands, not meeting her eyes. "What do you want from your life out here? Not what you think you should want, but what you actually want." No one had ever asked her that question before. Dorothy sat with it for a long moment, looking past Asher's shoulder to where the last light was fading from the sky outside the window. "I want to be useful," she said finally. "I want to do work that matters and be with people who see me for who I actually am rather than who they think I should be. I want to feel like I belong somewhere." She looked back at him, meeting his eyes. "What do you want?" "Mostly I have what I want already," Asher said slowly, "but sometimes I think it would be nice to have someone to share it with. The mountains are beautiful, but beauty does not mean much if there is no one to show it to. And conversation with pine trees gets old after a while, no matter how good a listener they are." Something electric passed between them, a moment of recognition and possibility that made Dorothy's heart beat faster. This man with his gentle voice and massive frame, this man who had defended her crooked seams and treated her with kindness, this man who lived alone in the mountains and clearly wanted something more. And Dorothy, who had been alone since her aunt died, who had been lonely even in crowded Philadelphia, who wanted so badly to matter to someone. "I should finish your shirts," she said. though what she wanted to say was something entirely different and far more dangerous. "You should," Asher agreed, though his eyes suggested he was thinking about more than shirts as well. "And I should get back to cutting firewood for old Sam. But Dorothy, I would like to do this again, have supper and talk, if you would like that too." "I would," Dorothy said, and felt like she was stepping off a cliff into open air, falling towards something she could not see but desperately wanted to reach. They walked back to the general store together through the autumn evening, and Asher left her at the door with a tip of his hat and a smile that warmed her more than her thin shawl ever could. Dorothy climbed the stairs to her small room and sat by the lamp, her heart full of feelings she was not quite ready to name but could no longer deny. She finished Asher's shirts over the next week, putting extra care into each crooked seam, each wandering stitch. The coat repair took longer because the damage was more extensive than he had indicated. The shoulder seam split almost completely open. Dorothy reinforced it with double stitching and added patches to the elbows where the fabric had worn thin. It would never be pretty, but it would hold against a mountain winter. Asher came by every few days, always with some excuse about checking on the progress or asking a question about measurements. But really, they both knew he was coming to talk. They would sit in Dorothy's small room with the door carefully left open, and he would tell her about his day cutting wood, or she would tell him about the customers in the store. And slowly they built something between them that felt solid and real and right. Mrs. Chen watched this development with knowing eyes but said nothing, though Dorothy occasionally caught her smiling to herself while stocking shelves. The church ladies were less circumspect. Mrs. Patterson made a point of warning Dorothy about the dangers of associating with rough mountain men, painting a picture of Asher as barely civilized and probably dangerous. Mrs. Henderson suggested that Dorothy was being fast and improper, entertaining a man in her rooms even with the door open. The younger wives whispered behind their hands and gave Dorothy pitying looks, as if she was making some terrible mistake that they could all see but she could not. Dorothy ignored them all. She had spent her whole life listening to people tell her what she was doing wrong, and she was tired of it. Asher Larson was kind and honest, and he treated her like she had a brain in her head and value beyond her domestic skills. If that made her improper, then she would happily be improper. On the day she finished the last shirt, she sent word through Mrs. Chen that Asher's order was ready. He arrived within the hour, his face lighting up when he saw her in the store. "All finished?" he asked hopefully. "All finished," Dorothy confirmed. "Would you like to come up and try them on?" He followed her upstairs, and Dorothy laid out the finished work on her table. 5 sturdy work shirts in brown cotton duck, all with crooked seams and visible stitching, and not a bit of decorative detail anywhere. His winter coat with its repaired shoulder and reinforced elbows. She held her breath while he examined each piece, testing the seams, checking the fit, running his big hands over the fabric. "Perfect," he said finally. "Dorothy, these are exactly what I needed. You did beautiful work." "It is not beautiful," Dorothy protested. "The seams are still crooked." "They are perfect," Asher repeated firmly. He pulled off his old shirt, unself-conscious in a way that made Dorothy quickly avert her eyes from his muscled torso, and put on one of the new ones. It fit him like it had been made for his body, which of course it had, the shoulders sitting right and the sleeves the perfect length. He turned to her with a grin that made him look boyish despite his beard. "What do you think?" "I think it suits you," Dorothy said honestly. The shirt might be plain and roughly sewn, but on Asher's powerful frame it looked exactly right. Practical and strong and built to last. "I am going to wear these every single day," Asher said, running his hands down the front of the shirt. "I am going to wear them until they fall apart," And then I am going to bring you the pieces and ask you to make me more. And if anyone says anything about the crooked seams, I am going to tell them that these are the finest shirts I have ever owned, and they can mind their own business." Something in Dorothy's chest felt like it was cracking open, letting in light and air and warmth. "You really mean that?" she said wonderingly. "I really mean it," Asher confirmed. He carefully folded the other shirts and the coat, stacking them neatly. "Dorothy, I need to tell you something, and I am just going to say it straight because I am not good at dancing around subjects. I think you are remarkable. I think you are smart and honest and brave for coming out here to the middle of nowhere to try to build a new life. And I think those church ladies are fools for not seeing how special you are." Dorothy's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. "Asher, let me finish," he said gently. "I am going back up to my cabin next week to get ready for winter trapping season. But I do not want to leave things unsaid between us. So I am asking, plain and direct, may I court you properly? May I write you letters from the mountains and come down to visit when I can and see if this thing between us is as real as it feels to me?" Dorothy thought about Philadelphia and her failed attempts to be what her mother wanted. She thought about arriving in Hot Springs and trying to be what the church ladies expected. She thought about crooked seams and wandering stitches and always falling short of some invisible standard she could never quite reach. Then she thought about Asher Larson wearing her imperfect shirts with pride, about his kind eyes and gentle voice, about the way he saw her as she actually was and liked what he saw. "Yes," she said, and felt like she was finally stitching her life together in a way that actually fit. "Yes, you may court me. I would like that very much." The smile that spread across Asher's face was brighter than lamplight. "Then I will write you the best letters I can manage, though fair warning, my spelling is not always reliable, and my handwriting looks like a drunk spider fell in the ink bottle." Dorothy laughed, actually laughed, and it felt like releasing something that had been trapped inside her for years. "That will make us a matched pair, then. My sewing is crooked and your handwriting is messy. We are both disasters at the things we are supposed to be good at. Or maybe we are good at different things than people expect," Asher suggested, reaching out to take her hand in his much larger one. His palm was calloused from hard work, his fingers gentle despite their strength. "Maybe we are exactly what we need to be, and everyone else just has the wrong expectations." Dorothy looked down at their joined hands and felt something settle into place in her chest, like a piece of a puzzle finally finding its proper spot. "Maybe you are right," she said softly. Asher stayed in town for 3 more days, and they spent every possible moment together that propriety would allow. He took her walking along the creek that ran south of town, pointing out animal tracks in the mud and teaching her the names of plants she had never noticed before. She showed him her favorite spot in Mrs. Chen's store, a corner near the window where the afternoon light was perfect for reading, and he bought her a book of poetry that had just come in on the supply wagon. They had supper at the hotel again, and this time Dorothy did not care at all about the stares and whispers. On his last evening in town, they sat on the porch behind the general store and watched the sun set over the distant black hills. The peaks were dark purple against the orange sky, and the air had the sharp, cold edge that promised winter coming soon. "I will miss you," Dorothy said, leaning carefully against Asher's solid shoulder. "I have known you for less than a month, but it feels longer somehow." "It does," Asher agreed, his arm coming around her shoulders in a way that felt protective and right. "But I will be back before Christmas to sell my furs and buy supplies, and I will write every week, I promise. There is a Dakota boy named Running Wolf who takes letters back and forth to the settlements for trade goods. I will give him my letters and he will bring me yours." "Every week," Dorothy repeated, committing it to memory. "I will write back every time." "Tell me everything," Asher said. "Tell me about the store and the customers and what you are reading and what you are thinking. I want to know all of it." Dorothy turned her face up to his, close enough to see the gold flecks in his brown eyes. "Tell me about the mountains and the animals and what you are doing. I want to picture where you are and what you are seeing." "Deal," Asher said, and then, very carefully, he bent his head and kissed her. It was Dorothy's first kiss, and it was everything she had imagined and nothing like she expected. His lips were soft despite his rough exterior. His beard tickled slightly, and the way his big hand came up to cup her face was so gentle she wanted to cry. The kiss tasted like coffee and hope, and when they pulled apart, Dorothy felt like she was glowing from the inside out. "I will come back," Asher promised, his forehead resting against hers. "I will come back to you, Dorothy. That is a promise." "I will be here," she replied, and knew it was true. Whatever happened, wherever her life led, she would be here waiting when Asher Larson came down from his mountains. He left the next morning before dawn, his pack loaded with supplies and his new shirts carefully wrapped in oilcloth to keep them dry. Dorothy watched from her window as he walked up the main street toward the North Trail, his powerful frame moving with easy confidence even under the heavy pack. He turned at the edge of town and looked back, and even from this distance, she could feel his eyes find her window. She raised her hand in farewell, and he lifted his in return, and then he was gone into the gray pre-dawn light. Dorothy felt his absence like a physical thing, an empty space where his presence had been. But she also felt something else, determination. She had work to do. That morning she approached Mrs. Chen with a proposal. "I would like to expand my work in the store," she said. "And I have an idea that might bring in more customers." Mrs. Chen regarded her with sharp black eyes. "What kind of idea?" "Practical sewing," Dorothy said. "Not fancy dresses or decorative things, but work clothes. Shirts and pants and coats for the men who come in from the mines and the mountains and the ranches. Sturdy stuff that is built to last, not to look pretty. I cannot compete with the church ladies for fine sewing, but I can make practical clothes that will hold up to hard use. And I will charge fair prices." Mrs. Chen was silent for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded slowly. "Smart thinking. Miners always need new pants, knees wear out fast. Ranch hands need tough shirts. Mountain men like Asher need everything." She paused. "I give you corner of store for your work. You pay me 10% of what you earn and I provide space and help you with customers." "Fair, more than fair," Dorothy said, relief flooding through her. "Thank you, Mrs. Chen. You will not regret this." "I know," Mrs. Chen said with a small smile. "I am good judge of character. You are hard worker and honest person. That is worth more than straight stitches." Dorothy set up her sewing corner that very day, dragging her aunt's machine downstairs and arranging it near the window where the light was good. She made a sign on a piece of board, "Practical sewing. Work clothes built to last. Fair prices." Mrs. Chen helped her hang it outside the store, and within 2 days she had her first customer. He was a young miner named Jack whose pants had split at the seam while he was working underground, and he needed a new pair in a hurry. Dorothy measured him quickly, bought sturdy canvas fabric from Mrs. Chen's stock, and had the pants done in 2 days. The seams were just as crooked as always, but they were strong and the fit was good, and Jack paid her happily and told his friends at the mining camp. More customers followed. Ranch hands who needed work shirts that could stand up to barbed wire and cattle. Freighters who needed heavy coats for driving wagons through winter weather. Even a few of the town's working men, the blacksmith and the stable keeper and the men who worked at the lumber mill, men who had no wives to sew for them and appreciated Dorothy's quick work and fair prices. The church ladies turned up their noses at her corner of the store, but Dorothy found she did not care. She was doing useful work and earning honest money and building something that was hers. And every week, without fail, a young Dakota man named Running Wolf would arrive at the store with a letter from Asher. The letters were exactly as Asher had warned. His spelling was creative, and his handwriting looked like it had been done during an earthquake. But the words were pure Asher, warm and honest and full of details about his life in the high country. He told her about setting his trap lines and building his winter stores of meat and firewood. He described the elk bugling during their fall rut, a sound like nothing else in the world. He wrote about the first big snowfall that came in mid-October and buried his cabin to the windows overnight. And he wrote about wearing her shirts every day, about how comfortable they were and how well they held up, about how he had been wearing one while tracking a mountain lion and gotten into some blackberry bushes, and the shirt had protected him from the thorns. "I told the lion about you," he wrote in one letter. "It did not seem impressed, but that might have been because it was too busy running away from me. I think if it had gotten a closer look at your fine stitching, it would have appreciated your work properly." Dorothy wrote back just as faithfully, telling him about her growing business and the customers she served and the satisfaction of doing work that mattered. She told him about the changing colors of autumn in hot springs, about the geese flying south in huge V formations, about the first frost that turned the grass white overnight. She told him what she was reading, what she was thinking, what she hoped for the future. And she told him that she missed him in every letter because it was true. October turned into November, and the weather grew colder. Dorothy used her earnings to buy a better coat and warmer boots, practical purchases that Asher would have approved of. She helped Mrs. Chen prepare the store for winter, bringing in extra stock of flour and sugar and coffee that people would need when the snow made travel difficult. She sewed steadily in her corner, her pile of finished work growing as men prepared for the hard months ahead. Mrs. Patterson came into the store one day and found Dorothy measuring a railroad worker for a new coat, the older woman's face pinched with disapproval. "I see you have found your level," she said coldly. "Sewing for rough men instead of decent folk. How appropriate." Dorothy looked up from her measuring tape and met Mrs. Patterson's eyes without flinching. "I am sewing for people who need clothes," she said calmly. "And I am earning an honest living doing it. That seems decent enough to me." Mrs. Patterson sniffed and turned to leave, then paused. "That mountain man you have been carrying on with. You do know he will not come back, do not you? Men like that do not settle down. He will find some other foolish girl to charm, and you will be left here with your crooked stitches and broken heart." Something cold settled in Dorothy's stomach, but she kept her voice steady. "Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Patterson, but I trust Asher to keep his word." After the woman left, the railroad worker shook his head. "Do not listen to that sour old crow," he said kindly. "I have met Asher Larson a few times when he has guided hunters through the hills. He is as solid as they come. If he said he is coming back, he will come back." "Thank you," Dorothy said, and meant it, but Mrs. Patterson's words had planted a seed of doubt that she could not quite shake free. What if Asher did not come back? What if the winter was too harsh or something happened to him in those distant mountains? What if he simply changed his mind and decided that a city girl with clumsy fingers was not worth the trouble? The letters kept coming every week, but as November wore on and the snow began to fall in earnest, Dorothy found herself watching the North Trail with increasing anxiety. Christmas was coming. Asher had promised to be back before Christmas. But Christmas was less than 3 weeks away, and there had been no sign of him. Then, on a bitter cold morning in mid-December when the snow was piled high on either side of the main street, Dorothy was working in her sewing corner when Mrs. Chen called out, "Dorothy, someone here to see you." She looked up and her heart stopped entirely. Asher Larson stood in the doorway, so covered in snow that he looked like a moving snowman. His beard was frozen, his hair was white with ice, and his eyes were red from snow blindness. But he was grinning like he had just won a fortune, and when he saw Dorothy, he strode across the store in 3 huge strides and swept her up into his arms, spinning her around despite her startled shriek. "I came back," he said, his voice rough from cold and disuse. "I promised I would come back, and I did." Dorothy threw her arms around his neck and held on tight, not caring that he was soaking her with melting snow, not caring that every customer in the store was watching, not caring about anything except that he was here and he was real and he had kept his promise. "You are freezing," she said when he finally set her down. "You are half frozen to death. What were you thinking traveling in this weather?" "I was thinking that I promised to be back before Christmas," Asher said, his hand still on her waist like he was afraid to let go. "And I keep my promises." Mrs. Chen bustled over with blankets and hot tea, scolding Asher in rapid Cantonese mixed with English about foolish men who risk their lives to keep promises. She shooed them upstairs to Dorothy's room where there was a small stove, and Dorothy built up the fire while Asher peeled off his frozen outer layers. "You could have died," Dorothy said, her hands shaking as she helped him with his coat. "If you got lost in the snow or fell through ice or a dozen other things, you could have waited until the weather cleared." "I could have," Asher admitted, accepting a cup of hot tea and wrapping his big hands around it. "But I did not want to. I wanted to see you, Dorothy. I have been thinking about you every single day since I left, and I was not going to let a little snow keep me away." "A little snow," Dorothy repeated incredulously, gesturing at the window where the blizzard was still blowing. "Asher, this is a full blizzard." "I have seen worse," he said with a shrug, then winced as the movement pulled at his cold, stiffened muscles. "All right, it is a pretty bad storm, but I made it through, and that is what matters." Dorothy wanted to scold him more, but the words died in her throat when she saw what he was wearing. It was one of her shirts, the first one she had made for him, and it was battered and stained and the elbows were worn thin from hard use. But the seams were still holding strong, every crooked stitch intact despite months of wear in brutal conditions. "You really did wear them every day," she said wonderingly, reaching out to touch the familiar fabric. "I told you I would," Asher said. "Dorothy, I have been wearing your shirts for 3 months in the mountains, and they are the best work clothes I have ever owned. They keep me warm, they hold up to rough use, and every time I look down at them I think about you and smile." "Do you know what that means?" "What?" Dorothy asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It means I have been smiling every single day since I left," Asher said. "Because I have been wearing your work and thinking about your face and reading your letters until the paper wore thin from handling. Dorothy, I came back early because I could not stand being away from you any longer. And I need to ask you something important, but I am going to warm up first because I do not want my teeth chattering when I do it." Dorothy made him drink 2 more cups of tea and eat the stew that Mrs. Chen brought up, and gradually the color returned to his face and his hands stopped shaking from cold. She sat beside him on her small bed, the only real furniture in the room besides the chair and table, and let herself enjoy the solid warmth of his presence. When he had eaten and warmed sufficiently, Asher set down his cup and turned to face her fully. "Dorothy, I have been alone in those mountains for 10 years and I thought I was happy. I thought I had everything I needed. But then I met you, and suddenly alone was not enough anymore. Suddenly I wanted to come home to someone at the end of the day. I wanted to share sunsets and good meals and conversation about everything and nothing. I wanted to build a life with someone instead of just building a survival. Dorothy's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. "Asher, I am not done," he said gently. "I know we have only known each other for a few months. I know that courting is supposed to take years and involve proper steps and approvals from family and all that. But out here, Dorothy, we do not have time for all that. Winter is hard and life is uncertain, and I do not want to waste a single day pretending I do not know my own mind. So I am going to ask you plain and direct, the way I do everything else. Dorothy Whitmore, will you marry me?" The room was very quiet except for the howl of the wind outside and the crackle of the fire in the stove. Dorothy looked at Asher's dear face, at the hope and fear warring in his warm brown eyes, at the strength in his shoulders and the gentleness in his big calloused hands. She thought about Philadelphia and her mother's disappointment, about arriving in Hot Springs alone and afraid, about learning that her crooked seams were good enough after all. She thought about his letters and her corner in the store, and the life she had been building piece by careful piece. And she thought about how, when Asher looked at her, she felt like she was exactly enough. Not too clumsy, not too different, not too anything, just right. "Yes," she said, and watched his face transform with joy. "Yes, Asher Larson, I will marry you. I would be honored to marry you." He kissed her then, and it was even better than the first time, full of promise and hope, and the certainty that they were choosing something real and true and worth fighting for. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Asher rested his forehead against hers. "I do not have a ring," he admitted. "I meant to buy you one in town, but the jeweler is closed because of the storm." "I do not need a ring," Dorothy said honestly. "I just need you." "You have me," Asher promised. "For as long as you will put up with me, you have me." The storm blew itself out over the next 2 days, and when the sun finally emerged, the whole town sparkled under a blanket of fresh snow. Asher had taken a room at the hotel for propriety's sake, but he spent most of his time at the general store, helping Mrs. Chen shovel snow and move supplies and charm the customers with his easy manner and genuine kindness. The church ladies were scandalized when they heard about the engagement, of course. Mrs. Patterson declared that Dorothy was making a terrible mistake, marrying a mountain man who would probably get himself killed by bears before the year was out. Mrs. Henderson worried loudly about how Dorothy would survive up in the mountains when she could barely sew a straight seam. The younger wives shook their heads and predicted disaster. Dorothy ignored them all. She was done caring what the church ladies thought. The wedding was held 3 days before Christmas in the small Lutheran church on the edge of town. The pastor was a kind old German man who did not seem to care that the courtship had been brief, asking only whether they were both certain of their choice and receiving fervent affirmations from both parties. Mrs. Chen stood up with Dorothy, and old Sam Watson, whom Asher had helped with firewood, stood up with him, and the ceremony was simple and brief and perfect. Dorothy wore her best dress and carried a small bouquet of pine branches since there were no flowers to be had in December. Asher wore his best shirt, one of the ones Dorothy had made, and stood at the front of the church looking like he could not believe his good fortune. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Asher kissed her like she was precious beyond measure, and Dorothy felt like she had finally found the place where she was meant to be. The reception was held at the hotel, and to Dorothy's surprise, quite a few people came. Mrs. Chen had made dumplings and brought them in covered baskets, still steaming hot. The miners and ranch hands and railroad workers, whom Dorothy had sewn for, came bearing gifts of canned goods and firewood and practical things that would help them survive their first winter together. Even a few of the town's more open-minded residents came to offer congratulations and wish them well. The church ladies stayed away, of course, but Dorothy found she did not miss them. Happy? Asher asked her during a quiet moment, his arm around her waist as they watched the impromptu celebration. Happier than I have ever been, Dorothy said honestly, leaning into his solid warmth. Thank you for finding me, Asher. Thank you for seeing me when everyone else was looking right past me. Thank you for making me want to be found, Asher replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. I did not even know I was lonely until I met you. Now I cannot imagine being alone again. They spent their wedding night at the hotel, which felt scandalous and wonderful and absolutely right. Asher was gentle and patient, and made Dorothy feel cherished in ways she had never imagined possible. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, talking about everything and nothing while the moon tracked across the winter sky outside their window. What is your cabin like? Dorothy asked, running her fingers through his long hair. I have been trying to picture it from your letters. It is small, Asher admitted. One room with a sleeping loft and a good stone fireplace, but it is solid and warm and the roof does not leak. And the view from the front porch is something you will never forget. I promise you that. I have never lived anywhere small, Dorothy said. In Philadelphia, our house had 12 rooms, and even my room above the store was larger than a one-room cabin must be. Does that worry you? Asher asked, his voice carefully neutral in a way that suggested he was more concerned than he wanted to admit. Dorothy thought about it honestly before answering. No, she said finally. I think I would rather have one small room with you than 12 large rooms without you. And besides, I am not afraid of small spaces. I am only afraid of small lives, and I do not think our life together will be small no matter how tiny the cabin is. She felt Asher relax against her, his arms tightening around her waist. You are going to love the mountains, he promised. I am going to show you everything. The high meadows in summer, the hidden waterfalls, the places where the elk gather. I am going to teach you to track and fish and read the weather in the clouds. We are going to have such adventures, Dorothy. I cannot wait, Dorothy said, and meant it with her whole heart. They stayed in Hot Springs for another week while Asher sold his furs and bought supplies for the rest of winter. Dorothy packed up her few belongings and said goodbye to Mrs. Chen, who hugged her fiercely and made her promise to come down to town in the spring. You are a good girl, Mrs. Chen said, her eyes suspiciously bright. You work hard, you are honest, you are kind. Asher is lucky man. I am the lucky one, Dorothy replied, returning the hug. Thank you for giving me a chance when no one else would. Thank you for seeing my value even when I could not see it myself. Ah, you always had value, Mrs. Chen said, waving a dismissive hand. You just needed right people to help you see it. Now go, live good life with your mountain man. Come visit in spring and tell me all about it. They left Hot Springs on a cold, clear morning right after the new year, heading north into the Black Hills with a pack mule loaded with supplies. The trail was steep and narrow, winding up through pine forests heavy with snow, and Dorothy was grateful for the warm coat she had sewn for herself, and the sturdy boots Asher had bought her. He led the way with easy confidence, pointing out landmarks and telling her stories about the country they were traveling through. It took 3 days to reach his cabin, and Dorothy was exhausted by the time it came into view. But when she saw it nestled in its small clearing with the mountains rising behind it like protective walls, she felt something in her chest settle and sigh with contentment. Home, Asher said simply, helping her down from her mule. What do you think? Dorothy looked at the small log structure with its stone chimney and covered porch, at the woodpile stacked neatly against one wall, and the smoke already rising from the chimney where Asher must have had a neighbor keeping the fire going. She looked at the pristine snow covering the clearing, and the towering pines all around, and the slice of distant peaks visible through the trees. She looked at Asher's hopeful face, his warm eyes watching her carefully for her reaction. "I think it is perfect," she said honestly. "I think it is exactly where I am supposed to be." The relief on Asher's face was almost comical. "You really mean that? You are not just saying it to be nice." "I really mean it," Dorothy confirmed. "Asher, I did not come west to live in another city and pretend to be someone I am not. I came west for this. For something real and true and different. This is everything I hoped for." He kissed her then, standing in the snow with the winter wind blowing around them, and Dorothy thought that she had never been happier in her entire life. The cabin was indeed small, just one room with a sleeping loft reached by a wooden ladder, but it was warm and clean and clearly built with care. The stone fireplace dominated one wall, already crackling with a welcoming fire. There was a rough table with 2 chairs, shelves for supplies, hooks for coats and tools, and a bed in the loft big enough for 2. It was simple and practical and utterly without pretense, exactly like the man who lived there. Over the next weeks, Dorothy learned what it meant to be a mountain wife. Asher taught her to snowshoe so she could move around in the deep snow, to read animal tracks so she would know what had been near the cabin, to recognize the signs of changing weather in the sky and wind. She learned to cook over an open fire and to make bread in a cast iron pot, and to stretch their supplies to last until spring. She learned to be comfortable in the vast silence of the winter mountains, where days could pass without seeing another human soul, and she sewed. In the evenings by firelight, she made clothes for Asher to replace the ones that were wearing out, and she made clothes for herself suited to mountain life. Her stitches were still crooked, her seams still wandered, but out here there was no one to criticize and no reason to care. The clothes were warm and sturdy and they did their job, and that was enough. Asher wore every piece she made with visible pride, showing them off to the other trappers when they would occasionally stop by the cabin for coffee and conversation. "My wife made this," he would say, running his hands down the front of whatever shirt he was wearing. "Best shirts I have ever owned. See how strong the stitching is. This will last me for years." And if the visiting trappers noticed that the seams were crooked, they never said a word. Out here, function mattered more than form, and Dorothy's work functioned perfectly. Winter slowly gave way to spring, and the mountains transformed. The snow melted into rushing streams, wildflowers emerged in brilliant carpets of color, and the animals came out of hibernation. Asher took Dorothy exploring, showing her all the places he had written about in his letters. They hiked to high meadows where elk grazed, to waterfalls that thundered down rocky cliffs, to vistas that stretched for miles in every direction. They fished in clear mountain lakes and picked wild berries and watched eagles soar overhead. And they talked. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing their days and their thoughts and their dreams. They talked about the future, about maybe building a bigger cabin or starting a guiding business or having children someday. They talked about the past, about the lives they had left behind and the choices that had led them here. They talked until they ran out of words, and then they sat in comfortable silence, just being together. In late spring, Dorothy discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks but waited to be certain before telling Asher. When she finally shared the news one evening over supper, his face went through a rapid series of expressions: shock, joy, terror, and then pure delight. "A baby," he repeated like he needed to hear it again to believe it. "We are going to have a baby." "In late fall, I think," Dorothy said, watching his face carefully. "Are you happy?" "Happy." Asher pushed back from the table and came around to sweep her into his arms, spinning her carefully before setting her down and dropping to his knees in front of her. He pressed his face against her still flat stomach, and his voice was thick when he spoke. "I am terrified and thrilled and so happy I could burst. A baby. Our baby." Dorothy ran her fingers through his long hair and felt tears prick at her eyes. "I am scared too," she admitted. "I do not know the first thing about being a mother. What if I am as bad at mothering as I am at sewing?" Asher looked up at her, his warm brown eyes fierce with conviction. "You are going to be a wonderful mother. You are kind and patient and strong, and our child is going to be so lucky to have you. And Dorothy, you are not bad at sewing. You are just different at it. And different can be exactly right if you stop trying to be like everyone else." As the months passed and Dorothy's belly grew, Asher became increasingly protective and attentive. He insisted she rest more. He took over the heavier chores. He brought her wildflowers and berries, and anything else he thought might make her smile. He built a cradle from pine wood, sanding it smooth until there was not a single splinter. And Dorothy sewed tiny clothes with her crooked stitches and felt her heart swell with anticipation. In October, they made the journey down to Hot Springs so Dorothy could be near proper help when the baby came. Mrs. Chen welcomed them with open arms and immediately took charge, declaring that Dorothy would stay in the room above the store until the birth. Asher took a room at the hotel again but spent most of his time at the store, hovering anxiously and driving both Dorothy and Mrs. Chen to distraction with his worry. "First-time fathers," Mrs. Chen said with an eye roll. "Always like this. Always thinking something will go wrong. You tell him to go chop wood or something useful." But Dorothy did not mind his hovering. It made her feel cherished and protected, and she had learned that Asher's way of showing love was through action rather than words. The baby came on a cold November night during the first big snowstorm of the season. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Dorothy wondered if she would survive it. But Mrs. Chen had assisted at dozens of births and knew exactly what to do. And when dawn broke gray and cold over the snowy town, Dorothy held her son in her arms and felt like her heart might explode from the sheer, overwhelming love. Asher was allowed in once the baby was cleaned, and Dorothy was settled, and the expression on his face when he saw his son for the first time was something Dorothy would treasure for the rest of her life. He approached the bed like he was approaching something holy, his big rough hands trembling as he reached out to touch the baby's tiny head. "He is perfect," Asher whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "Dorothy, he is absolutely perfect. Look at his little hands. Look at his face. We made this." "You made this." "We made this," Dorothy corrected gently. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names during the pregnancy but had not settled on anything definite. Now, looking at their son's small, scrunched face, Dorothy knew exactly what felt right. "I want to name him after you," she said. "Unless you hate the idea of having a junior running around." "I love the idea," Asher said immediately. "Asher Larson II, or maybe we could give him his own first name but use my middle name. I am Asher James." "We could call him James Larson if you like that better." "James," Dorothy said, testing the name. "James Larson, I like it. Jamie when he is small." "Jamie," Asher repeated and smiled down at his son. "Welcome to the world, Jamie. Your mother and I have been waiting to meet you." They stayed in Hot Springs through the winter, giving Dorothy time to recover and Jamie time to grow stronger before making the journey back to the mountains. Asher worked odd jobs around town to earn money, and Dorothy slowly resumed her sewing business in the corner of Mrs. Chen's store. Women would come by to see the baby and stay to place orders for practical clothes for their husbands and sons. And Dorothy's reputation as the seamstress who made clothes that lasted began to spread beyond Hot Springs. The church ladies remained disapproving, but a few of the younger women started to seek Dorothy out, asking her advice about frontier life and admiring her obvious happiness with her rough mountain man and their healthy baby boy. Mrs. Patterson made one last attempt to save Dorothy from her poor choices, cornering her in the store one day while she was sewing. "It is not too late, you know," the older woman said, her voice dripping with false concern. "You could stay here in town where it is safe and civilized. You could raise your son properly instead of dragging him up into those savage mountains. You could leave that man and make a respectable life for yourself." Dorothy set down her needle and looked Mrs. Patterson directly in the eyes. "My life is already respectable," she said calmly. "I have a husband who loves me, a healthy son, and work that I am good at. I am happier than I have ever been in my life. Why would I give that up to meet your definition of proper?" "Because you are making a mockery of yourself," Mrs. Patterson hissed. "Everyone knows you cannot sew properly. Everyone knows those seams are crooked and those clothes are a disaster. You are an embarrassment." "Maybe to you," Dorothy said, "but my husband wears every crooked seam with pride, and my customers keep coming back for more. That tells me I am doing something right, even if it does not look the way you think it should. Now, if you will excuse me, I have work to do." Mrs. Patterson left in a huff, and Dorothy went back to her sewing with a smile on her face. She had finally learned the lesson that Asher had been trying to teach her from the beginning. Her worth was not determined by other people's standards. She was enough exactly as she was, crooked stitches and all. When spring came and the trails cleared, they packed up Jamie and their belongings and headed back to the mountains. The cabin felt like a homecoming, and Dorothy settled into her life as a mountain wife and mother with contentment that ran bone deep. Jamie thrived in the clean mountain air, growing chubby and healthy and curious about everything around him. Asher was a devoted father, carrying his son on his back in a pack while he checked his trap lines, talking to him constantly even though Jamie was too young to understand. Years passed in a rhythm of seasons. Winters spent cozy in the cabin, springs full of new growth and possibility, summers hiking through high meadows, autumns preparing for the cold months ahead. Dorothy's sewing business continued to grow through word of mouth, and trappers and hunters would stop by the cabin to place orders, knowing that Dorothy Larson's clothes were crooked but strong, built to last through anything the mountains could throw at them. They had 2 more children, a daughter named Rose when Jamie was 3, and another son named Thomas when Rose was 2. The cabin grew more crowded but never felt too small, not when it was full of love and laughter and the chaotic joy of family life. Asher built additions as needed, adding a second room and expanding the loft, but always keeping the essential character of the place they had started their life together. Dorothy taught her children to sew, and she did not worry when their stitches were crooked like hers. She taught them that what mattered was strength and function, not appearance. She taught them to value honesty and kindness and hard work over social status and pretty manners. She taught them to be themselves, fully and unapologetically, regardless of what anyone else thought. And every single day, Asher wore the clothes she made for him with obvious pride. Even when they were patched and faded and worn thin from years of use, even when the crooked seams were more visible than ever, he wore them like they were finer than anything money could buy. Because to him, they were. Every crooked stitch represented his wife's love and care, and that made them more valuable than any perfectly sewn garment could ever be. On their 10th anniversary, they made the trip down to Hot Springs so Dorothy could visit Mrs. Chen and show off the children. The town had grown in the intervening years, new buildings springing up along the main street, but some things remained the same. Mrs. Chen's store was still there, and the old woman cried happy tears when she saw how Dorothy's family had flourished. They had supper at the hotel restaurant, the same place Asher had taken Dorothy for their first official meal together a decade ago. The children were well behaved, curious about the town but clearly more comfortable in their mountain home. After the meal, while the children explored the hotel lobby under Mrs. Chen's watchful eye, Asher took Dorothy's hand and led her to a quiet corner. "I have been thinking," he said, his warm brown eyes serious. "It has been 10 years since I asked you to marry me in your little room above this store. 10 years since you said yes to a rough mountain man with more hope than sense. And I wanted to tell you that every single day since then has been better than the day before, because I have spent them with you." Dorothy felt tears prick at her eyes. "Asher, let me finish," he said gently. "I know I do not say it enough. I am better at showing than telling. But I want you to hear this, Dorothy. You are the best thing that ever happened to me. You took a lonely man living alone in the mountains and gave him a home. You gave me a family and a purpose and a reason to come down from the high country. And you did it all while being exactly yourself, crooked stitches, an honest heart, and stubborn determination to succeed on your own terms. I love you, Dorothy Larson. I loved you when I first met you, and I will love you until the day I die." "I love you too," Dorothy said, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved me, Asher. You saw me when no one else did, and you made me believe I was worth something. You taught me that different does not mean wrong, and that the right person will love you for exactly who you are. You gave me everything I ever wanted, even though I did not know I wanted it until I found you." He kissed her then, right there in the hotel corner where anyone could see, and Dorothy kissed him back with all the love and gratitude and joy that filled her heart. When they finally pulled apart, they were both laughing, giddy with happiness and the weight of a decade of love well lived. The next morning they prepared to head back to the mountains, and Mrs. Chen pressed a package into Dorothy's hands. "For you," she said. "Open it when you get home." Dorothy hugged her goodbye and promised to visit again soon, then climbed onto her horse with Rose settled in front of her. Asher rode ahead with Jamie and Thomas, the pack mule following behind loaded with supplies. They looked like what they were, a frontier family heading home, practical and strong and perfectly suited to the life they had chosen. That evening, safe back in their mountain cabin with the children tucked into bed and the fire crackling in the hearth, Dorothy opened Mrs. Chen's package. Inside was a beautiful piece of silk fabric in deep blue, far finer than anything Dorothy had ever worked with. There was also a note in Mrs. Chen's careful handwriting for special dress. "You earned right to wear beautiful things, but if you want, use for practical clothes instead. You always know what is right for you. Proud of you, daughter of my heart. Mrs. Chen." Dorothy held the silk and felt tears slide down her cheeks. She looked up to find Asher watching her with a gentle expression. "What will you make with it?" he asked. Dorothy thought about it for a long moment, running the smooth fabric through her fingers. She could make a fancy dress like the church ladies wore, prove that she could do fine sewing if she wanted to. Or she could make something practical and useful, staying true to who she had become. "I am going to make you a shirt," she said finally. "A good sturdy work shirt with crooked seams and strong stitches, because that is what I do best. And you are going to wear it with pride." "I will wear it every single day," Asher promised, crossing the room to pull her into his arms. "Just like I have worn everything else you have ever made me." Because every crooked seam reminds me of the woman I love, and there is nothing in this world more beautiful than that." Dorothy leaned against his solid chest and listened to his heartbeat and thought about the strange journey that had brought her here. From Philadelphia to Hot Springs to these mountains, from failed seamstress to mountain wife, from loneliness to love. She thought about the church ladies who had criticized her crooked stitches, never understanding that those imperfect seams would hold together a life more rich and full than any perfect hemline could ever create. She thought about Asher wearing her work every single day with pride, turning her perceived flaw into something worth celebrating. She thought about her children learning that different was not wrong, that strength mattered more than appearance, that love was built on acceptance rather than change. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Thank you for loving my crooked seams." "Thank you for making them," Asher replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Every single one is perfect to me." And in that moment, in their small cabin in the Black Hills with their children sleeping peacefully and the mountain wind singing outside, Dorothy knew with absolute certainty that she had found exactly where she belonged. Not despite her crooked seams, but because of them. Because those imperfect stitches had led her to a man who valued strength over beauty, function over form, honest work over social approval. She had learned to sew the way she was meant to sew, and in doing so had stitched together a life that fit her perfectly, crooked seams and all. The years continued to pass in their mountain home, each season bringing its own joys and challenges. Jamie grew into a strong young man who looked like a younger version of his father, with the same broad shoulders and warm brown eyes. He learned to track and trap from Asher, and to sew practical repairs from Dorothy, becoming as comfortable in the mountains as his parents were. Rose proved to have her mother's quick mind and her father's physical courage, equally happy reading by the fire or hiking steep mountain trails. Thomas was quieter than his siblings, with a gift for working with wood that saw him carving beautiful things from pine and aspen. Dorothy's reputation as a seamstress continued to grow, and people would travel significant distances to commission work from the woman who made clothes that lasted. She never did learn to sew a straight seam, but she stopped apologizing for it. Her crooked stitches became her trademark, a sign of authentic work by Dorothy Larson that would outlast anything more conventionally made. Asher expanded his guiding business, taking wealthy Eastern hunters into the high country and bringing back enough money to ensure his family was comfortable. But he always made time for his family, never letting work take precedence over the people he loved. He taught his sons to be strong but gentle, his daughter to be brave but kind, and all of them to value honesty and integrity above social status or wealth. On their 20th anniversary, they held a celebration at their mountain cabin that drew trappers and traders and friendly Dakota families from all over the Black Hills. The children helped prepare food and set up tables outside in the clearing, and when evening came they lit a huge bonfire that could probably be seen from Hot Springs 20 miles away. Mrs. Chen had made the journey up despite her advancing age, and she sat in the place of honor beside the fire while people told stories and played music, and celebrated 2 decades of successful marriage. At one point, a young woman from one of the Dakota families approached Dorothy with a shy smile. "I heard about your sewing," she said in careful English. "That you make clothes that last. I am getting married in the spring, and I want to make my husband practical clothes for our life together. Will you teach me?" Dorothy looked at the young woman's eager face and felt something warm bloom in her chest. "Of course," she said, "but I should warn you that my stitches are not straight. They never have been." The young woman looked confused. "Why does that matter?" My grandmother says you make the strongest clothes she has ever seen. She says your seams never fail, even after years of hard use. That is what I want to learn." Dorothy glanced over at Asher, who was watching her with a proud smile, and then at her children clustered around the fire, and then at the assembled crowd of people who had traveled here to celebrate their love. All of them wearing clothes she had made over the years, crooked seams proudly visible, worn with the casual confidence of people who valued function over fashion. "Then I will teach you everything I know," Dorothy said to the young woman. "And the first lesson is this: do not try to sew like anyone else. Sew like yourself and make your work strong enough to last. The rest is just decoration." She started teaching after that, taking on a few students who wanted to learn practical sewing rather than fancy embroidery. She taught them to cut fabric efficiently, to make strong seams even if they were not perfectly straight, to reinforce stress points and choose appropriate materials. She taught them that sewing was not about impressing people, but about creating useful things that would serve their purpose well. And she always began each lesson by showing them Asher's oldest shirt, the very first one she had made for him 20 years ago. It was patched and faded, and the crooked seams were more prominent than ever, but every single stitch still held strong. "My husband has worn this shirt for 2 decades, she would tell her students. "He has worn it hunting and trapping, chopping wood and building additions to our cabin. He has worn it in blizzards and heat waves, through all kinds of hard use that would have destroyed a fancier garment in months. And it has never failed him, because I made it strong instead of pretty. That is what I will teach you to do." Asher continued to wear that first shirt on special occasions, pulling it out with reverent care and putting it on like a badge of honor. People would sometimes ask him why he kept such an old worn thing when his wife could easily make him a new one, and his answer was always the same. "This is the first gift my wife ever made me," he would say. "She told me her seams were crooked and her work was poor, but I wore it anyway because I could see the care and effort in every stitch. And you know what? This shirt has outlasted every piece of clothing I owned before I met her. Every single one. So you tell me whose work is poor." The story of the mountain man who wore his wife's crooked seams with pride spread throughout the Black Hills and beyond. Traveling traders carried it to distant settlements, where it became a kind of legend about the value of honest work and unconditional love. Some people hearing the story would smile at the romance of it. Others would see the deeper meaning about accepting people as they were rather than trying to change them into something they were not. And a few people, usually women who had been made to feel inadequate for failing to meet some arbitrary standard, would hear the story and feel something inside them loosen and breathe. If Dorothy Larson could build a good life and a successful business with crooked seams, maybe they could succeed too despite their own perceived flaws. Maybe different did not mean wrong. Maybe being yourself was enough. When Jamie turned 21, he asked his father to help him build his own cabin further up the mountain, where he had found a beautiful spot overlooking a valley full of wildflowers. Asher helped him fell the logs and raise the walls, and Dorothy sewed curtains and blankets and clothes for the young woman Jamie was courting, a doctor's daughter from Hot Springs who loved the mountains as much as he did. When Rose was 19, she announced that she wanted to become a teacher and opened a small school in her parents' cabin, teaching the children of trappers and traders and local Dakota families who wanted their kids to learn English and mathematics. Dorothy supported her completely, even though it meant their home was constantly full of children and noise and energy. When Thomas was 17, he started a furniture-making business, crafting beautiful tables and chairs and cabinets from mountain wood. His pieces were prized for their strength and beauty, and people would travel significant distances to commission work from the young craftsman, whose mother had taught him that functional could also be beautiful. And through it all, Asher and Dorothy remained the steady center of their growing family. They aged together gracefully, their love deepening with each passing year. Asher's hair went gray and his beard went white, but his warm brown eyes never changed and his strength never faded. Dorothy's dark hair silvered at the temples and fine lines appeared around her eyes, but her hands remained steady, and her determination never wavered. They celebrated their 30th anniversary with all their children, and their growing collection of grandchildren gathered around them. Jamie and his wife had 3 sons who were already learning to track and trap. Rose had married one of the Dakota men who traded with Asher and had twin daughters who spoke both English and Dakota fluently. Thomas had married a quiet girl from Hot Springs and had a baby daughter who he carved toys for from soft pine wood. The cabin complex had grown over the years, expanding from the original one-room structure into a small compound of buildings housing different family members and serving different purposes. But the original cabin remained at the center, still warm and cozy and full of memories. On the evening of their anniversary, after the grandchildren had been put to bed and the other adults had retired to their own spaces, Asher and Dorothy sat on the porch of that original cabin and watched the stars come out over the mountains. Dorothy was sewing by lamplight, working on a shirt for one of her grandsons, and Asher was carving a toy horse from a piece of pine. "Do you ever regret it?" Asher asked suddenly. "Leaving Philadelphia and coming out here to the middle of nowhere, living in a tiny cabin instead of a grand house. Sewing for mountain men instead of society ladies." Dorothy looked up from her crooked seams and met her husband's eyes, seeing the genuine curiosity there mixed with just a touch of concern, as if after 30 years he still worried that she might wish for something different. She set down her sewing and reached over to take his hand, feeling the familiar calluses and scars earned from 3 decades of hard work. "Not for a single second," she said firmly. "Asher, in Philadelphia I was a disappointment and a failure. I could not meet anyone's expectations, and I spent every day feeling inadequate and wrong. But you made me feel like I was exactly right just as I was. You took my biggest flaw and turned it into something to be proud of. How could I ever regret that?" "I did not turn it into anything," Asher said, squeezing her hand gently. "I just saw it for what it actually was, strength instead of weakness, practicality instead of failure. You did the hard work of changing how you saw yourself. With your help," Dorothy insisted. "With your patience and your acceptance, and your stubborn refusal to see me the way everyone else did. You saved my life, Asher Larson. Not in some dramatic way, but in the everyday way of making me believe I was worth saving." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the wind in the pines and the distant sound of an owl hunting. Then Dorothy picked up her sewing again and said quietly, "You know what I am most grateful for? That our grandchildren will never know what it feels like to be ashamed of who they are. They are growing up seeing that there are different ways to be successful, different ways to be worthy. They are learning that love is about acceptance rather than change. We are giving them that, Asher. We are giving them the freedom to be themselves." "We are," Asher agreed, and his voice was thick with emotion. "And it all started with crooked seams and a mountain man who was too stubborn to care what anyone else thought. And a city girl who was desperate enough to believe him," Dorothy added with a smile. They finished their projects and went inside, banking the fire and climbing the ladder to their loft bedroom. They fell asleep wrapped around each other, the way they had for 30 years, and Dorothy's last thought before drifting off was that she was exactly where she was meant to be, More years passed, bringing both joy and sorrow as all years do. Mrs. Chen passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 86, and Dorothy wept for the woman who had been the first to give her a chance in Hot Springs. Old Sam Watson followed a year later, and Asher spoke at his funeral about the kindness Sam had shown to a young mountain man who just needed someone to see his humanity. But there were happy times too. More grandchildren were born, and then great-grandchildren, until Dorothy lost count of how many people called her grandma. The family compound in the mountains became a gathering place for anyone who needed help or shelter or just a friendly face. Dorothy's students spread throughout the territory, teaching other women to make strong, practical clothes with their own unique style, and the legend of the seamstress with crooked seams became woven into the fabric of Black Hills history. On their 40th anniversary, Asher gave Dorothy a gift that made her cry. It was a quilt, painstakingly stitched together from pieces of every shirt she had ever made him over the decades. Some pieces were faded and worn thin, others still showed bright colors, but every single one bore her distinctive crooked seams. He had saved scraps from each garment as it wore out, collecting them secretly over the years, and then worked with Rose to piece them together into this tangible reminder of 40 years of love and dedication. "Every crooked seam tells a story," Asher said as Dorothy ran her hands over the quilt with trembling fingers. "This one is from the first shirt you made me, when you were so convinced it would fall apart, but it lasted 5 years. This one is from the winter coat that kept me warm through that terrible blizzard of '83. This one is from the hunting shirt I was wearing when Jamie was born. Every piece is a memory, Dorothy. Every crooked stitch is proof that what we built together was strong enough to last." Dorothy could not speak through her tears, so she just held the quilt close and let Asher wrap his arms around her. They stood like that for a long time, surrounded by their family and the life they had built together, and Dorothy felt a contentment so deep, it was almost painful. That night, they spread the quilt over their bed, and Dorothy traced the familiar wandering lines of stitches she had made over 4 decades. Some were tighter, some looser, some barely visible and others standing out prominently, but all of them held strong, just like her marriage. Just like her life. "I never thought I would live to see 70, Asher said, settling into bed beside her. "Mountain life is hard and most men do not last this long. But here I am, 70 years old and still strong enough to chop my own firewood, and you know why." "Why?" Dorothy asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "Because I had a reason to stay alive," Asher said simply. "Because I had you to come home to every night, and children to raise, and grandchildren to spoil, and a life that meant something beyond just surviving. You gave me that, Dorothy. You gave me a reason to fight through every hard winter and every difficult season. You gave me a life worth living. We gave each other that," Dorothy said, rolling to face him in the darkness. "I was lost before I found you, Asher. I did not even know who I was supposed to be. But you helped me figure it out. You helped me understand that I did not need to be anyone but myself, crooked seams and all." They fell asleep holding hands, the way they had for 40 years, and Dorothy dreamed of Philadelphia and the girl she had been, so lost and confused and certain she would never find her place in the world. She dreamed of the stagecoach journey west and the terror of arriving in Hot Springs alone. She dreamed of the church lady's criticism and her own crushing self-doubt. And then she dreamed of Asher standing in her doorway, this massive, gentle man who had seen value where everyone else saw failure. She dreamed of every shirt she had sewn, every crooked seam she had made stronger than any straight one could be. She dreamed of her children and grandchildren, all of them carrying forward the lesson that being yourself was enough. She woke to dawn light streaming through the loft window and Asher's warm presence beside her, and she smiled. 62 years old, and she was still waking up beside the love of her life, still sewing with her crooked stitches, still living the adventure she had hoped for when she boarded that stagecoach west so many years ago. The seasons continued their eternal cycle, and Dorothy and Asher aged into their 70s and then their 80s. Their bodies grew slower and their joints ached more, but their spirits remained strong. They spent their days surrounded by family, watching their great-grandchildren play in the clearing where they had built their first home together so long ago. Dorothy still sewed, though her hands were not as steady as they once were, and the work took longer. But her stitches were still crooked and still strong, and people still sought her out for practical clothes that would last. Asher still wore every piece she made with pride, though now he mostly sat by the fire instead of ranging through the mountains like he once had. On a warm summer evening when Dorothy was 84 and Asher was 89, they sat on their porch and watched the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren were scattered around the compound, going about their evening routines, and the sound of laughter and conversation drifted on the air. "We did good," Asher said quietly, his aged hand finding Dorothy's. "Look at all of this, Dorothy. Look at what we built, this family, this community, this life. We did good." "We did," Dorothy agreed, leaning carefully against his shoulder. "And you know what the best part is? Every single person here knows they are loved for exactly who they are. No one is trying to change anyone else. No one is being told they are not good enough. We taught them that, Asher. We taught them that love means acceptance." "You taught me that first," Asher pointed out, "when you agreed to make me those shirts even though you knew they would not be perfect, when you chose honesty over pretense. You taught me that being real was better than being proper." They sat together as the light faded and the stars emerged, still holding hands after all these years. Dorothy thought about the journey that had brought her here, about every choice and every crooked seam that had stitched together this unlikely and wonderful life. She thought about the girl she had been in Philadelphia, so desperate to fit in and so convinced of her own failure. She thought about arriving in Hot Springs with nothing but hope and determination. She thought about Asher standing in her doorway, offering her a chance when no one else would. And she thought about every shirt she had made, every crooked seam she had sewn, every piece of clothing that had kept her husband warm and protected through decades of mountain life. Those imperfect stitches had become the foundation of everything good in her life, proof that strength mattered more than beauty and function mattered more than form. "Thank you," she said softly into the gathering darkness. "Thank you for wearing my crooked seams with pride every single day. Thank you for seeing value where everyone else saw failure. Thank you for loving me exactly as I am." "Thank you for being exactly who you are," Asher replied, his voice still warm and gentle even after all these years. "Thank you for teaching me that different does not mean wrong. Thank you for showing me that the best things in life are often the ones that do not look like everyone else's. Thank you for your crooked seams, Dorothy. Every single one of them is perfect to me." They went inside as the night grew cold, Asher helping Dorothy up from her chair with the same gentle care he had always shown. They climbed the ladder to their loft bedroom more slowly now, their movements careful and measured, but they still slept wrapped around each other under the quilt made from 40 years of crooked seams. Dorothy Larson lived to be 91 years old, sewing almost until the day she died. Her last project was a shirt for her youngest great-great-grandson, a sturdy brown cotton work shirt with seams just as crooked as the first one she had ever made. She finished the last stitch on a peaceful spring morning, tied off the thread with hands that trembled slightly, and then settled back in her chair with a satisfied smile. "It is done," she told Asher, who at 96 was still by her side. "One more shirt with crooked seams for one more person I love." "It is beautiful," Asher said, running his weathered hands over the familiar, uneven stitching. "Just like all the others, just like you." Dorothy passed peacefully in her sleep that night, her hand in Asher's, surrounded by the life they had built together. Her funeral was attended by more than 200 people, representing 3 generations of family and friends whose lives she had touched with her kindness and her honesty and her stubborn insistence on being exactly herself. At the service, Jamie stood up to speak about his mother. He was 67 years old himself now, his hair white and his face weathered, but his voice was strong as he addressed the crowd. "My mother taught me many things," he said. "She taught me to value honesty over appearance, substance over style, reality over pretense. But the most important thing she taught me was this: being different is not the same as being wrong." Her seams were crooked, and people criticized her for that all her life. But my father wore those crooked seams with pride every single day because he understood what those critics never did. Those crooked seams were stronger than any straight ones could be because they were made with love and care and determination to do the best work she could, regardless of what anyone else thought. That is the legacy she left us. Not perfection, but authenticity. Not conformity, but courage. Not straight seams, but strong ones. After the service, they buried Dorothy in a small cemetery on the mountain overlooking the valley she had loved. Asher insisted on standing beside the grave despite his age, supported by Jamie and Thomas, and he placed the first handful of earth himself. "Rest easy, my love," he said quietly. "You earned it. You lived a life worth living, and you left the world better than you found it. I will see you again soon." He was right. Asher Larson passed peacefully in his sleep 3 months later, at the age of 97, and they buried him beside his beloved wife. On his grave marker, beneath his name and dates, they carved a simple phrase that captured the essence of their love story. "He wore her crooked seams with pride." The family compound in the Black Hills remained, passed down through generations who kept the buildings maintained and the memories alive. The original cabin became something of a shrine, carefully preserved with the old stone fireplace and the sleeping loft and the corner where Dorothy had done her sewing. Visitors would come to see it, to hear the story of the seamstress who could not sew straight and the mountain man who loved her anyway. And they would leave feeling like maybe their own imperfections were acceptable too. The quilt, made from 40 years of crooked seams, became a family heirloom, carefully preserved and brought out on special occasions. Great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren would run their fingers over the wandering stitches and hear stories about the couple who had built an empire of love on a foundation of honest acceptance. The quilt became a reminder that strength came in many forms, that beauty was found in unexpected places, and that the best things in life were often the ones that did not look like everyone else's. Dorothy's students carried on her tradition, teaching practical sewing with an emphasis on function over form. They spread throughout the West, these women who made clothes that lasted and taught others to value substance over style. And whenever someone would comment on a crooked seam, these women would smile and tell the story of Dorothy Larson, who had turned her perceived flaw into her greatest strength. The church ladies of Hot Springs eventually faded into history, their names forgotten while Dorothy's lived on. Mrs. Patterson and Mrs. Henderson and all the others who had criticized and judged were lost to time, while the woman they had dismissed as incompetent became a legend. Because in the end, kindness and authenticity outlasted propriety and pretense. In the end, loving someone for who they were proved more powerful than trying to make them into something they were not. The legend spread, carried by traders and travelers throughout the frontier and beyond. She cannot sew a straight stitch. They had criticized, but the mountain man wore every crooked seam with pride daily, and in doing so taught the world a lesson about the true meaning of love and acceptance. The story became part of the fabric of Western folklore, a reminder that the best love stories were not about two perfect people finding each other, but about two imperfect people choosing to see beauty in each other's flaws. And somewhere in the mountains of South Dakota, in a small cemetery overlooking a valley full of wildflowers, two graves stood side by side. The stone markers were weathered now, the inscriptions worn but still legible. Dorothy Whitmore Larson and Asher James Larson, together in death as they had been in life. The mountain winds sang through the pines around them, and the seasons turned as they always had, and the crooked seams that had bound two lives together held strong even beyond the grave. Because love like that did not die. It transformed and continued, passed down through generations in stories and quilts, and the simple understanding that being yourself was always enough. That different did not mean wrong. That the right person would love you not despite your flaws, but because your flaws were part of what made you uniquely, wonderfully you. She cannot sew a straight stitch. They had criticized all those years ago. But Asher Larson had worn every crooked seam with pride daily, and in doing so had proven that sometimes the most beautiful love stories were stitched together with imperfect threads. Sometimes the strongest bonds were the ones that wandered and meandered but never broke. Sometimes the greatest gift you could give someone was accepting them exactly as they were, crooked seams and all. And that truth, carried forward through generations of Larson descendants, remained as strong and unbreakable as Dorothy's stitching had ever been.